Chelsea Bruck was a 22-year-old with a bright future, full of life and warmth, until one fateful Halloween night changed everything. That night, she left a crowded party with Charles Chuck Kay, a man she barely knew. What began as an ordinary evening quickly spiraled into a chilling tragedy as Chelsea's life was brutally stolen from her in the woods just miles from where she had been celebrating. The question that lingered in the air: why? What drove Chuck to murder someone he had no real connection to? This is the heartbreaking story of Chelsea Bruck and the shocking twists that unraveled in the search for justice. In the fall of 2014, Chelsea Bruck, a 22-year-old woman from Monroe, Michigan, attended a Halloween party that would become the last night of her life. Chelsea was a beloved young woman, known for her infectious smile, kind heart, and easygoing nature. She had a reputation for always putting others before herself, and her friends and family cherished her. On the night of October 25th, 2014, Chelsea was excited about the Halloween festivities. She had spent days putting together an elaborate costume, dressing as a character from the popular movie The Purge, complete with dramatic makeup and a haunting expression. It was the perfect costume for a night of fun, and Chelsea was ready to enjoy it with her friends. The party was being held at a warehouse on the outskirts of town, an event that was known to attract a large crowd. The Halloween party was a highlight of the season, a chance for everyone in the area to come together, let loose, and enjoy the festivities. Chelsea arrived at the party around 9 p.m., and as she mingled with friends and acquaintances, it was clear she was in high spirits. Laughter filled the air, and the sound of music bounced off the walls of the warehouse. People were dancing, talking, and enjoying the night. But there was a sense of excitement in the air as well, the thrill of wearing costumes and pretending to be someone else for a few hours. But as the night wore on, Chelsea's friends began to notice that something was off. She had started to drift away from the group, and by midnight, she was no longer responding to text messages. As time passed, concern grew among her friends. Chelsea had never been one to disappear without telling anyone, especially at a big event like this. They tried calling her phone, but there was no answer. At first, they assumed she had just stepped outside for a breather or was talking to someone else in the crowd. However, as the minutes turned into hours and Chelsea still didn't return, the worry turned to panic. By 2 a.m., the party was winding down, and many of the guests had left. The warehouse, once filled with laughter and excitement, was eerily quiet. Chelsea's absence was no longer something that could be brushed off as just a misunderstanding. Her friends began retracing their steps, asking anyone they could find if they had seen her leave. Some people remembered seeing her around earlier, but no one had seen her leave. The last thing anyone remembered was Chelsea walking out of the warehouse, alone, in the direction of a wooded area that lay just beyond the party venue. The situation grew more urgent as hours passed. Chelsea's friends contacted her family, but there was no sign of her anywhere. Her mother, heartbroken and frantic, called the police to report her daughter missing. The police immediately began investigating. They spoke to people who had attended the party, but no one seemed to have any solid information. They scoured the area near the warehouse, hoping to find any clue that might lead to Chelsea. The woods that bordered the party venue were thick with trees and dense underbrush. It was a place people often went to be alone, but it was also a place that could easily swallow someone up without leaving a trace. As the days went by and no one heard from Chelsea, the fear in her family and friends grew. They clung to the hope that she would be found, but the more they searched, the darker the reality became. Chelsea's disappearance felt more and more like something sinister had happened. It was clear that Chelsea didn't just wander off. Something had happened to her, and it was as if she had vanished into thin air. The town of Monroe, once peaceful and quiet, now felt on edge. The community rallied together, posting flyers and organizing search parties, but with each passing day, the chances of finding Chelsea alive seemed to slip further away. The questions began to pile up. Where was Chelsea? Why hadn't she called anyone? Who would want to hurt someone as kind and loving as her? It was the beginning of a heartbreaking journey that would uncover far more than anyone could have imagined. Over a month had passed since Chelsea Bruck's disappearance, and the small town of Monroe had grown restless. The community had banded together to search the woods, post flyers, and offer any information they could, but still, there was no sign of Chelsea. Her family, desperate for answers, continued to hold on to the hope that she would return. With each passing day, the hope that she might be found alive seemed to fade, replaced by an overwhelming fear that something far worse had occurred. The police had been working tirelessly on the case, but leads had been scarce. That is, until November 18th, 2014. A hunter out in the woods just miles from the party venue made a discovery that would change everything. The hunter, who was walking along a path deep in the forest, noticed something unusual, a shape partially hidden under the thick brush. As he approached, the chilling reality set in. What he had stumbled upon was the lifeless body of a woman. The body was in a state of partial decomposition, concealed with branches and leaves as though someone had tried to hide it. The hunter immediately called the authorities, and within hours, the area was swarming with police, investigators, and search teams. The body was soon identified as Chelsea Bruck. Her family was notified, and their worst fears were confirmed. Chelsea had not just vanished, she had been murdered. The news was devastating. For weeks, they had held out hope that their daughter, sister, and friend would come home safely. Now, they were left with the horrifying reality that she had been taken from them, violently and senselessly. Forensics quickly went to work, gathering evidence from the scene. The body had been moved post-mortem, and Chelsea's remains showed signs of blunt force trauma to the head and neck. There was no sign of defensive wounds, indicating she had been caught off guard, possibly attacked from behind. The location of the body, deep in the woods, raised more questions than answers. Why had Chelsea been out there? Why hadn't anyone heard from her after she left the party? The wooded area was not far from the party venue, but it was still isolated. It was unclear whether Chelsea had known her killer or if she had been lured to the location by someone she trusted. Police began retracing Chelsea's steps, speaking to everyone who had been at the party. They also worked to piece together her movements in the hours leading up to her disappearance. Surveillance footage from nearby businesses and homes, along with witness statements, revealed some key information. Chelsea had been seen leaving the party at around midnight, alone, and headed in the direction of the woods. No one had seen her with anyone else, which deepened the mystery. Was Chelsea being followed? Was there someone waiting for her in the darkness? The police dug deeper into Chelsea's background, hoping to find a clue about who might have wanted to harm her. As they sifted through her relationships and personal history, they discovered that Chelsea had no enemies, no reason to fear for her safety. She had been living a relatively quiet life, working, socializing with friends, and pursuing her passions. There was no sign that she had been involved in any risky behavior or relationships that might have led to this tragedy. Her life was simple, and yet someone had decided to end it. The investigation now shifted toward finding answers in the most troubling way possible, the search for a killer who had left no immediate trail. The community, shocked and devastated by the loss of a young life, rallied around Chelsea's family. Local news stations broadcast her story, hoping someone would come forward with new information. The outpouring of support was overwhelming, but it wasn't enough to bring answers. Chelsea's family and friends were left asking the same painful question. Who had taken Chelsea, and why? The police were determined to find the killer, but as weeks turned into months, the answers remained frustratingly out of reach. What had begun as a missing person case was now a full-scale murder investigation, one that would ultimately lead to chilling revelations about the dark forces hiding in plain sight. The discovery of Chelsea Bruck's body in November had shattered the town of Monroe, but it was only the beginning of a lengthy and troubling investigation. As detectives pieced together the timeline of events, they began focusing on those who were at the Halloween party that night. The night Chelsea disappeared had been filled with noise, music, and revelers in costumes. But one man in particular stood out in the investigation, Chuck K., a 29-year-old who had been at the party and had been seen in close proximity to Chelsea earlier in the evening. Chuck had been one of the many attendees at the warehouse party, But his connection to Chelsea was more significant than that of many others. They had shared mutual friends, and while they weren't particularly close, they had interacted throughout the night. Some witnesses later recalled seeing the two chatting for a while in the crowded party space. But the most important detail came from a few people who had seen Chelsea leave the venue with Chuck. It was unclear exactly when the two had decided to leave, but what was certain was that they had been seen walking away from the warehouse, together, into the night. The police started by questioning Chuck, eager to understand what had happened after they left the party. Chuck claimed that after leaving the party, they had walked together for a while, but then he had turned in the opposite direction to go home. According to him, they had not stayed together long, and Chelsea had continued walking in the direction of the woods where her body was later found. Chuck told authorities that he didn't know what had happened after they parted ways, and that he hadn't seen Chelsea again. He appeared cooperative, but something about his story didn't sit right with investigators. To the police, Chuck's version of events seemed suspicious. It was hard to believe that someone who had been so close to Chelsea in the hours leading up to her disappearance had simply parted ways without incident, especially considering Chelsea had been walking alone into an area that was known to be isolated and dangerous at night. But without any direct evidence to link him to the crime, the case remained stagnant. As detectives dug deeper into Chuck's past, they began uncovering a troubling history. Chuck wasn't a stranger to law enforcement. He had previously been involved in several altercations and had a reputation for being unpredictable and aggressive, especially when intoxicated. There were no criminal convictions to speak of, but his name had come up in several reports over the years due to fights and disturbances. Despite his history, he had always managed to slip under the radar of serious criminal charges. This background raised further concerns about Chuck's potential involvement in Chelsea's death. Investigators began looking into his phone records, his whereabouts after the party, and his interactions with others during the night. Chuck's story started to unravel when his cell phone records were reviewed. His phone had pinged off cell towers near the woods where Chelsea's body was discovered, at the exact time investigators believed Chelsea had been killed. The timing, combined with his close proximity to the scene, made Chuck the prime suspect in the case. With this new information, the police brought Chuck in for further questioning. They confronted him with the evidence, but Chuck stuck to his story. He denied any involvement in Chelsea's death, claiming that he had simply gone home after their brief encounter. But the mounting evidence against him painted a very different picture. His phone records, his inconsistent statements, and his prior history of aggression all pointed toward one possibility. Chuck had been involved in Chelsea's death. Despite his continued denial, investigators were convinced that they had found their prime suspect. The case now took a more serious turn. With Chuck under intense scrutiny, the police began gathering more evidence. The investigation into Chelsea's tragic end was far from over. But with Chuck's connection to the crime becoming clearer, it seemed as though they were getting closer to uncovering the truth behind her death. Yet, even as they moved forward, the mystery surrounding Chelsea's final moments remained shrouded in darkness. And the shocking twist was still to come. As Chuck K. remained the prime suspect in the murder of Chelsea Bruck, investigators worked tirelessly to build a case against him. Despite his continued denials, there was mounting evidence that suggested he had played a pivotal role in Chelsea's death. His cell phone records placed him near the woods where her body was found, and his history of aggression only deepened the suspicion surrounding him. However, the breakthrough that would solidify the case came from an unexpected source, a former friend of Chuck's. This individual, who had known Chuck for years, had kept quiet about something he had learned soon after Chelsea's death. For months, he had remained silent, but something about Chuck's continued lies to authorities and his nonchalant attitude toward Chelsea's murder finally prompted him to come forward. This former friend reached out to the police, offering critical information that would change the course of the investigation. The man told detectives that shortly after Chelsea's disappearance, Chuck had confided in him about what had really happened that night. According to this friend, Chuck had admitted to attacking Chelsea. The friend described a disturbing conversation in which Chuck revealed that he and Chelsea had gotten into an argument after leaving the party. The details Chuck shared with him were chilling. He spoke about how things had escalated quickly when Chelsea refused to calm down, how he had become angry and violent. Chuck had confessed that he struck Chelsea in the head, knocking her unconscious. As she fell to the ground, he said he panicked, knowing that he had gone too far. Instead of helping her, Chuck reportedly dragged her deeper into the woods and left her there, hiding her body with branches and leaves. The former friend's statement was crucial because it included information about the attack that only the killer would know. Chuck had not mentioned these details to anyone else, making it clear that he had been involved in Chelsea's death. The confession, coupled with the physical evidence and Chuck's inconsistent statements, provided the missing link in the case. It was clear that Chuck had not only been involved, but had been responsible for Chelsea's murder. When Chuck was confronted with this new information, his story began to fall apart. The police presented him with the details from his friend's confession, and the pressure of the investigation seemed to crack his resolve. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Chuck finally admitted to his role in Chelsea's death. He described the events of that night in a way that matched the physical evidence found at the scene. His confession revealed the horrifying truth. The violence that had started in a drunken argument had spiraled out of control, leading to Chelsea's tragic death. Despite his confession, Chuck's defense team tried to argue that he had acted in self-defense, claiming that Chelsea had become combative and that he had been forced to protect himself. But the prosecution was relentless. They pointed out that the evidence showed no signs of Chelsea fighting back or defending herself, and the severity of the injuries indicated that she had been attacked while unable to defend herself. Furthermore, the confession Chuck had made to his friend revealed that there had been no immediate threat to his safety. He had simply lashed out in anger, and it had escalated into murder. Chuck's trial was a media spectacle, and the public was horrified by the details that emerged. The family and friends of Chelsea, who had spent months desperately seeking answers, were finally able to understand what had happened to her. Although the truth was devastating, there was a sense of closure in knowing that the man responsible for her death had been brought to justice. In the end, Chuck was convicted of second-degree murder, and he was sentenced to prison. Chelsea's family, though relieved that justice had been served, struggled to reconcile the young man they had known with the brutal killer who had taken their loved one's life. The town of Monroe, too, was left to grapple with the horror of the crime, and many would never forget the shocking betrayal of someone they had once considered just another local acquaintance. Though Chelsea's life had been taken too soon, the pursuit of justice and the revelations that followed brought some sense of closure to the tragic case. The memory of Chelsea Bruck, a kind-hearted young woman with a bright future ahead of her, lived on in the hearts of those who loved her. Chelsea Bruck's tragic death left a deep scar on her family, her friends, and the entire community of Monroe, Michigan. After Chuck K's conviction, many hoped that the case would finally be put to rest, that justice had been served. Yet, for Chelsea's loved ones, the resolution of the case didn't bring the peace they had longed for. The pain of losing her, the cruelty of how her life had been taken, would never fully dissipate. And though Chuck's conviction marked the end of a legal chapter, the story of what had truly happened to Chelsea remained incomplete, with unsettling questions lingering in the background. One of the most persistent questions was why Chelsea had been targeted in the first place. While Chelsea had known Chuck, they were not close friends, and there had been no apparent reason for him to lash out in such a violent manner. Investigators had examined every aspect of her life, her social circle, her work, her personal relationships, but there was no obvious motive. The idea that Chelsea, a young woman with a bright future, had simply been at the wrong place at the wrong time haunted her family and friends. It was a random act of violence, one that had no clear explanation, and that made the loss even more unbearable. As the years passed, Chelsea's family continued to search for answers. They never stopped asking why this had happened to her. Why a man with no apparent connection to her had felt the need to take her life so violently. Some speculated that Chuck's aggression had been fueled by something other than his brief encounter with Chelsea. Perhaps something deep within him that had been triggered by the party atmosphere, alcohol, or a personal issue he had never disclosed. But no matter how much they speculated, they could never fully comprehend what had been going on in Chuck's mind in the hours leading up to Chelsea's murder. Another troubling question was whether anyone else had been involved. Chuck's confession, while chilling and detailed, had been limited to his own actions. Yet there were whispers in the community that Chuck might not have been alone that night. Some people claimed to have seen other individuals around the area, though no concrete evidence ever emerged to suggest that anyone else had participated in the attack. It was a thought that continued to trouble Chelsea's family, who wondered if there were more people out there who knew the full truth and had remained silent, unwilling to come forward. Chelsea's death also raised questions about the larger issue of violence in small towns, how it could be hidden beneath the surface, just waiting to erupt. Though the town of Monroe was close-knit and peaceful on the outside, the dark reality of Chelsea's murder forced people to confront the fact that even in quiet communities, there can be hidden dangers. It made people rethink who they trusted, what dangers lurked in their midst, and how little they sometimes knew about the people around them. The lingering pain of Chelsea's loss was compounded by the sense that her life had been cut short without meaning. She was so much more than just a victim of a random crime. She had been a daughter, a sister, and a friend to many, someone whose warmth and kindness had touched everyone she met. Her family and friends honored her memory by organizing events in her name, raising awareness about violence, and sharing stories of the joy she had brought to their lives. But no matter how much they honored her, the grief never fully left. Chelsea's case remained a constant reminder of how fragile life can be and how a single night can alter everything. The hunt for answers, the pursuit of justice, and the years of pain and sorrow following her death have left a permanent mark on everyone involved. Her family's quest for understanding and closure never fully ended with Chuck's conviction. They were left with the knowledge that no amount of justice could ever replace the vibrant, beautiful life that was so senselessly taken from them. As time went on, Chelsea Bruck's memory continued to live on, not just through the people who knew her, but through the broader impact her case had on the community and beyond. Her tragic story served as a stark reminder of the importance of speaking out, of seeking justice, and of never taking for granted the loved ones who surround us. In the end, Chelsea's story was not just about loss. It was about the strength of the people who fought for her memory, for justice, and for the hope that one day, no one would have to endure the kind of heartbreak that Chelsea's death had caused.